Hello, and thank you very much for coming along again this evening. This evening, we're going to have a look at a kind of progress report on a new international effort to try to coordinate and facilitate research among a lot of different national traditions in the realm of the history of the slave trade and its aftermath. One of the problems we have with that whole history is that it's divided up into so many different traditions, different languages, and different ways of keeping records. So that while we think we're studying the same thing in all parts, in fact it's different in the Portuguese tradition, the Dutch tradition, the French tradition, the English tradition, and they all have archives and annotations for this period that were very different. Now, in Africanists and Americanists, especially Latin Americanists, and those interested in the slave trade in North America, begin to try to integrate that material to take a holistic look at the globalization of Africa since 1492, since the beginning of the slave trade. It's hard to do because you have to basically do this as research, often as a PhD research. You can only get a grant for a few years. You don't have enough time to learn new languages and go to new countries, get introduced to the proper authorities that will give you access to the proper archives and the like. It's a multi-year project just to get anything going in any one tradition. English, French, Dutch, Portuguese. Well, the effort now is to bring together with digital technology the equipment and the resources so that we can share that material once it's accessed. We can share it in a digital form with each other without having to travel, and indeed with the ability to have multinational conferences online by sharing data ahead of time. Sharing, for example, a text that's been very rare or hard to acquire. If it's digitally encoded and available to scholars from several different traditions, it will be possible to hold international colloquia or research seminars, inviting one another to do further research on the levels of information that have been revealed in one project after another as people look into this. And this is what's beginning to happen, and we want to look at in detail in reference to castles and dungeons on the coasts and islands, retracing some steps in the Atlantic slave trade. This is an international digital humanities project, and it's an update, in a sense, from a larger project that's called the Mapping the Slave Trade Project from 1556 to 1823. This was an international online digital map archive created for reference, research, and teaching in African and American history. And this new aspect of it is trying to take advantage of some of the new digital technology that makes it possible to run serious, extended, and in-depth research on documents that were previously only available in single parts of the world, the tradition in France, or in Holland, or in Portugal, or the like. Now there are some similar projects underway, and they serve as a bit of an inspiration in a way. Northeastern University put together ECTA, as it's called, the Early Caribbean Digital Archive. Now this is quite innovative in the sense that the Caribbean became the focal point of the end of the slave trade, and it's possible to acquire documents that could be digitally archived and shared amongst scholars. And the kinds of narratives that are available from that are really quite interesting. from Edward Long to Thomas Jefferson, slave masters have written about slaves, but no one's really looked at the documentation in the imagery beneath it. And what we want to look at in a way is the documents in conjunction with the images. Because here's what informs the image of the slave, the image of Africa. As Gikandi put it, Simon Gikandi, from Edward Long to Thomas Jefferson, slave masters turned to writing as a will to power, record keeping, and the archiving gesture was an attestation to the authority of natural history, the key to the ideology of white power. He who controls the documents, in other words, controls the narrative. Well, a new kind of narrative can emerge if a new set of documents are made available for everyone to study. And that's what's beginning to happen in the digital age. Individual scholars like Vincent Brown, Professor Vincent Brown here at Harvard, have made great use of historical maps in their research. In his detailed study of the slave revolt, for example, in Jamaica in 1760-61, he did a fantastic job of animating an interactive map online for students of Jamaica to learn a great deal about this very important revolt that occurred, in fact, before the American Revolution. The Caribbean, of course, is a matter of some interest to all of the European powers, since they all established plantation economies there. And it's in part in reference to the shared effort here to pool archival material for all of them to start to share and think about what in effect can be seen from space very easily. From space you can see that the Caribbean forms a geologic unity of islands that are spread out in such a way as to represent chains of volcanoes and plate tectonics, that is the collision of different plates, tectonic plates in geologic terms. But if you wanted to look in detail at the social history of this, you'd have to encounter the fact that Europeans controlled a lot of the area of the Caribbean, and particularly the British here are highlighted in red as being dominant in these particular areas. And they set up a trade between Africa and the Caribbean in order to provide slave labor, because the Caribbean populations died rapidly in reference to the new diseases introduced in the European trade. They had no immunities to them, and as many as 90% of the populations on the islands died within a few decades of the arrival of the first sustained trading contacts. The West Indies became the focal point of this triangular trade, and it had to do with the export of agricultural surplus, or I should say agricultural products, to Europe. They're manufacturing them there into used and finished products. The sale then down to Africa of things like guns and powder, and to some extent cloth in the later years, and then the export from West Africa of slaves to the Caribbean and the New World in general. This is well known, and it's been part of the study of the Caribbean for a long time, but it's now starting to become part of the study of Africa too, and the person who started to look at it in detail, Philip Curtin, did a book on the slave trade, but also on the image of Africa. It was first published in '64, republished in 2 separate paperback volumes in 1973, but it's important to remember that Phil Curtin received his PhD from Harvard in '53 with a dissertation on the revolution and decline in Jamaica from 1830 to 1865. His focus was on the West Indies initially. And for that reason, the natural link-up between West Africa and the West Indies was maintained by early scholars and is quite important to maintain in this digital era. Henry Louis Gates, here in Cambridge, has underscored the importance of doing this, and he's recalled for us some of the importance of the immigration policies during Black History Month on an annual basis. But it's in reference to those volumes, rather old volumes in venerable libraries like the Boston Athenaeum, the Boston Public Library, the Rare Books Collection, or the Houghton Library over at Harvard, that we're beginning to look for new kinds of evidence. One important new field in African history is being launched with a close digital examination of the historical text and their printed maps. This is crucial. There are maps in most of these early accounts, drawn by Europeans who are on the coast of West Africa, did not realize what was going on for the most part in the interior of Africa, but recorded maps very carefully. In fact, the maps of West Africa are more diligent and detailed than those of North America at the time. You can find some of these in rare book libraries, like the John J. Burns Library over at Boston College. These are the collections, including the University Archives, but they're basically their rare book collection over there, and you can connect with the Burns Library with the aid of librarians and archivists who are able to get you the useful sources you're looking for. We can start with the travelogues that are individually written, or encyclopedia that are compiled, and compilations of travel books. There were efforts to, in effect, create a Reader's Digest of the different travelogue accounts and different slave trade information systems, and they were put together in compendiums, compilations at the time. And you could see they had text, obviously, down here. This is the book, but each one of these books usually had a series of fold-out maps. And while the texts have been studied in great detail, it's only recently that we've developed the digital technology to study the maps collaboratively in detail. By collaboratively, I mean that we can digitize the maps and make them available to people well beyond the scope of the library that contains the maps. If you do a good job of digitization, these maps can be shared electronically around the world and with groups of scholars in England, France, Portugal, Brazil, the West Indies, and throughout the North American scholarly community. And that's what's beginning to happen with this digital mapping effort. They'll take a map of the West African Guinea coast, which became known as the Gold Coast at the time. A French map like this contains a lot of detail, which if you zero in on it, is pretty extraordinary in its fantastic detail. If you blow it up enough, you can see that they're indicating different forts and different anchoring spots. These are an indication of the fathoms for anchoring ships. And here's an indication of Dick's Cove, of Fort Anglais. This is a French map, so the Cap des Trois Points is the French indication here. But right here is the Dick's Cove. Up here is a Fort Hollandais, that's a Dutch fort. Well, these forts are detailed in these maps if you study them, and you need to go back to the general map like this, and now with the digital technology we can amplify that and make it legible on a scale that is detailed enough to make really quite powerful generalizations and pose new kinds of research questions. What kinds of things were coming out of Dick's Cove at the time? Well, if you can look back at the text, you can find some things out, and there are illustrations in the text that point out that this is the fort of the English in Dick's Cove, and they even give the floor plan of the forts. It's pretty extraordinary when you realize it. This is an architectural rendition of what's inside that fort. And you can see it nowadays in photographs by people in low-flying airplanes that go by the area and make their photographs available. You can, in fact, try to zero into this through places like Google Earth. If you can get a web connection, you can now parachute into virtually every one of these coastal castles and dungeons and take a look at what went on, what must have gone on in this space. This is a kind of specialized realm of what might be called industrial archaeology in the slave trade period. You can look at the inside of these forts and perhaps get permission from the Ghanaian government, if you have an organized dig, to start doing a systematic archaeology of some of these forts. They're pretty formidable structures. It's hard to see how they could be assaulted or overcome, except by other European powers. And that's the point when you look at them. Yes, they housed slaves, and slaves were led down to dungeons, where they were kept within these fortresses until the slaving ships came by to pick them up to take them to the New World. During that period, they were fed crops that were New World crops. It's a very interesting history of the chapter of West African history. It has to do with biological history. It didn't do you any good as a slave trader to deliver slaves to the New World that weren't going to survive. So you spent a lot of time as a slave trader figuring out what your slaves had to eat and would have to eat in the New World. In fact, you experimented with those crops in West Africa in order to make sure that the slaves you put on the ship were going to survive not only the Middle Passage, but survive living in the New World on New World crops. So all around these areas, as you can see from the early diagrams, actually back here, see that? That's a garden plot, which is visible in the early diagrams, but we haven't done the archaeology of the cultivation of this region yet to figure out what part of the area was being used for agriculture. It suggests that it was this slope here, but it may well have been a schematic representation and not a physical representation of where it was. In any case, we can now go through that material and look at these lower areas and see whether crops were grown here for the Middle Passage. Here you'll see that the guns are pointed out to the sea, because the main rivals in this trade for the English were the French and the Dutch and the Portuguese, which were coming in by sea, not over land. These were elaborate fort structures, not just a casual encampment for coastal trade. These had to both be dungeons, that is, secure places to keep enslaved people until the slave ships came by in the favorable season of winds that could take them to the West Indies, but they also had to be fortified positions against other Europeans wishing to take over that slave trade. Entrepot, that is the toehold on the coast. So these are significant structures, viewable now from space and analyzable in detail for their architecture and for the history that each one of them represents, including the military history. If you look in detail, you can see that here we have King George's symbol. Now, King George was King George when the Americans instituted their War of Revolution, right? George III was the King of England at the same time that these guns were aimed out at European rivals off the coast of West Africa. It's fascinating to look at this in detail and to look at the different castles up and down the coast. Elmina Castle was another slaving fort, much larger than Dick's Cove. If you looked at it from the sea, it looked like this. It was a very imposing structure right on the edge of the rocky coast here. And it had considerable levels, about 5 stories of different things. And the dungeons were down below here where the slaves were kept. They were let out at the point of getting onto ships from doors like this, right? Very low down, very unlit, no light access whatsoever, dark dungeons that kept the slaves until the slaving ships came by to pick them up. Extraordinarily intricate in their design and multifunctional capacity. They were supporting not only the European traders, but also a significant number of European troops designed to protect that spot against other intruders, other Europeans that were trying to take over that coast, plus the slaves. So you had to import a good deal of food to a castle like this, and that's one of the interesting things that needs to be examined in detail. What were the provisioning supplies required to keep a castle as big as this, filled with hundreds of slaves and scores of European military and marine, as well as commercial officers, alive? Most of whose focus, as I mentioned, was out to rivals coming in from the sea. But these areas were under regular and sustained attack in many cases, so militarism was built into it. Cape Coast Castle is another grand example of a castle in the current state of Ghana, which can be viewed from space. These are pictures taken from satellites, and you can analyze them up close and see how they're related to this triangular trade in the West Indies. It's from there and from this westernmost tip of Africa that we see, from the island of Gorée, some of the most interesting, enduring castles and dungeons. This one in particular was important to the Dutch and eventually the French who took it over. You can see from the sea it looked like this. From the satellite it looks like this. And from the maps at the times it looks like this. This is what's beginning to be studied in detail now for every single port in the coast of Africa as part of this transatlantic trade. We can start to realistically retrace some steps in the Atlantic trade as part of an international digital humanities project. Places like Dick's Cove and the entire coast of the Gold Coast can now be mapped in detail and studied from all aspects. This is why an international group, a new kind of citizen science alliance, is emerging to look at these important issues.